Our next speaker, another topic that I'm yearning to learn a lot more about. We're going to be talking about risk-limiting audits. So come on up, Neal. I think we're just going to do a little, just water. Great. All right, thank you. Just make sure. So we've got Neal McBurnett. Nice to see you today.
Delightful. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you for being here and again taking the time and offering your time to educate the people about risk-limiting audits. So please introduce yourself to our audience today and let them know who you are and what you're about.
Hi, I'm Neal McBurnett, and I've been interested in elections for a long time. I think I put up the first approval voting site on the internet back in the early 90s. Using some of the original material that was out there. And I've just been interested in all kinds of things relating to that, but especially after the 2000 elections, got interested in the integrity of elections. And obviously, it wasn't so obvious to a lot of people. We passed some laws. HAVA is a law that changed our elections away from paper, in effect, to electronic systems, digital record electronic systems, where there was no durable, auditable record of the elections. So we've been working very hard since then to not only get paper ballots, but to actually look at them. I'm a computer scientist, and so I know that the right people can make computers do anything they want, which may not be what the user of the computer really wants. So we have to check the results, and that's what we're doing.
Well, I appreciate that. I know Harvey Branscombe wanted to be here today. He's been a part of every symposium. I know he had a family thing that he had to attend to. So Harvey, we're thinking of you. So is this?
I thought we had the version of the slides that had Harvey's name on it. I thought I actually just looked at that.
Well, we mentioned Harvey. He's here in spirit.
He updated the slides in significant ways. So if you have a new version of it, that'd be great. But these will work also.
Okay. So this is the version we have then? Okay, this is it. All right, so
we're going to talk about a bunch of different things here. The importance of auditing elections, different kinds of audits, risk-limiting audits, and other kinds. The hardest thing in auditing elections is actually getting the right data, the data that you are going to audit. And that's a mess, as so many other people have pointed out in their talks. Getting geocoding information and boundaries and stuff for gerrymandering is a problem. It's a big problem here too. And then we'll talk about what Colorado has done and what the rest of the world is doing. And we'll also touch, because there's so much interest in different voting methods, on new ways that we've come up with to audit instant runoff voting, star voting, all those kinds of things. So next slide. It's very important to audit elections. It's very important to check the results of the computer tallying. A lot of people don't even want computer tallying in the first place, and much of the world doesn't do it. But when you put 50 issues, 50 contests on a single ballot, it gets pretty hard to count those all by hand. So we do use computers, and what we want to do then is check the results of the computers. It's important that we confirm the outcome of an election more than the actual count, because it would be actually prohibitive to hand count every contest, every ballot, and make sure that the numbers were exactly right. But as long as the right people are in office or the right decisions are made, we're in good shape. Machines interpret the ballots, and sometimes the machines are not very good at figuring out what a human was trying to convey. Sometimes the contrast is bad. There's all kinds of reasons. So it is important to check this. And there are elections that have been miscalled and certified with the wrong results because nobody actually looked at the ballots. So serious problem. That has happened in Rhode Island, which caused them to pass a law requiring audits. It has happened just recently in Pennsylvania, and they suddenly got up and did a recount overnight and came up with a different result, and then they actually claimed to do an audit that they didn't really do, so we're still hoping that they will clarify what they've done and open up the process. But audits are important. So next slide. In general, we want to frame this in terms of evidence-based elections. A lot of people used to think you could certify equipment. You could take voting machines and pass them through a lot of tests and make requirements and assume that their results were right. But again, as a computer scientist, I and many other people know that there are bugs and there are all kinds of people who can change the ways that the computers operate. So we need to actually certify the elections instead of certifying the equipment. And so each election should come up with a body of evidence that is shared with the public, and that will allow the public to check in one case the tabulation of the paper ballots, and in other cases there are other audits that we need to do. We need to make sure that the number of ballots that we're counting is pretty much the same as the number of voters that actually voted in the election. We need to look at signature verification and chain of custody of the paper ballots. So there's other things we need to audit too, but the most of what I'll talk about today is the actual, did the tabulation of the ballots happen accurately? Next slide. And this is really the summary of the points that I want to make. I'll be supporting a lot of these points as we go along, but the top priority is to have paper ballots, hard records that cannot be hacked from another state, that cannot be hacked by a manufacturer or an insider or some other threat actor. So a voter-verified paper ballot, something the voter has actually seen the actual paper and can verify that it's what they're intending. And the best way to do that is to do hand-marked paper ballots. Most of us are familiar with this. The mere act of filling it out generally verifies the ballot. There are cases, I must say, where people misunderstand the instructions on the ballot or they miss a contest. So there are ways that even hand-marked paper ballots may not verify, the voter may not correctly verify what other people would think when looking at the ballot, but they're the best we have. Another thing that is required for accessibility is a ballot marking device. We need to have a way that any voter can independently and privately cast a vote. The problem with, well, I'll talk more later about some of the problems with ballot marking devices, but they aren't verified as well. The other main point that I want to make, and I'll show you how well it has worked in Colorado, is that it is helpful when we do a central count of the ballots. The reason that that's helpful is we then don't worry, we can preserve the order of the ballots as it's scanned, and we can then match each ballot with a computer record of that exact ballot, and then compare a selection of ballots and see if the paper record actually says the same thing of a particular ballot, says the same thing as the electronic record of that ballot, the cast vote record we call it. And so when we can do that matching, we can do extraordinarily efficient audits. The more common voting method in the US is actually a precinct count method, and we don't want the ballots, the record of the ballots, to be available in order because there are a number of people that know what order ballots in a particular precinct were cast. You can have an observer watching everyone vote and know the order they go in. So we don't want to preserve a record of that in order, and that means we can't actually match the computer record of the ballot with the paper ballot, and that makes it harder to do the most efficient audits. So the main thing is it's actually an advantage to do central counting of ballots because we can preserve the order and do this efficient method of auditing. So let's move on, but those are the points to remember. There is a great deal of controversy today around ballot marking devices, and the main issue is, there are a lot of issues. They're very expensive. There's evidence of political campaign contributions being tied to legislators buying these very expensive machines in ways that don't make sense. But from a security standpoint, the biggest issue is that you'll fill your ballot out on a machine. You'll look at it over and over. It'll ask you to verify it. You'll finally print it. And in some of these cases, it's printed under a piece of glass. And it's even hard to make it out in small type and so on. And after the voter has pressed the cast the vote ballot and gotten a printed record, they rarely actually look at the printed record. And the printed record might be different than what they saw on the screens. So this is called a presentation attack. And they have no way of proving that they didn't actually vote the way that the printed record came out. So it's going to be very difficult if somebody does this kind of attack of the voting machine for a voter to prove that there was a problem. And most voters aren't even going to bother to look. And so there's a lot of difficult things we need to do to ensure that voters actually verify their paper ballot when it's printed with a ballot marking device. You can put somebody in front of a scanner and say, please look at your ballot. Please verify for me that it's the right way that you intended to vote. And that does increase the rates in some tests that have been done. But it's a serious problem that we need to look at. And so the easiest thing to do right now is to go with a less expensive approach. Let people vote with a hand-marked paper ballot. And then we have much more confidence that they verified their ballot. Or to find some ways to innovate more around how to verify ballots. So let's go ahead and move on to the different kinds of tabulation audits. The most common thing that people do is to audit just a fixed percentage of the precincts, or maybe a fixed number of ballots. And those are helpful. They actually get people looking at ballots, but they can be difficult to actually match to the election data. There are other approaches that are better, but what I'm going to advocate for and what increasingly is being adopted around the country is a risk-limiting audit. And this is an audit in which you audit more if there's a smaller margin, and you audit less if there's a wider margin in the contest. So you audit each contest, and if the contest is close, you might have to sample a lot of ballots and do this comparison with the paper in order to confirm the results. But if it's a judge retention race or something that people probably are less invested in and there's a much wider margin, you don't need to look at very many ballots. A couple of dozen ballots statewide for a judge retention race in Colorado might confirm the outcome. But if it's a very tight contest, again, you have to put more work on it. So that's what a risk-limiting audit will do. I also want to mention, because hopefully it's a wave of the future, there are ways that are actually magical inventions of mathematics that allow you to prove, the voting system can let the voter prove to themselves that their ballot was cast as they intended and counted as they intended in the final results, but not to prove to anyone else that that's how they voted. So it can't be used for coercion, but it can be used to allow a voter to know that everything worked and their vote showed up in the final results as they intended. There's a couple systems that do that, including free open source software that's available to manufacturers today to include in their systems called Election Guard. I'd love it if I could get a glass of water. So those are coming. I won't talk any more about them, but they're marvels of mathematics. Let's look at the next slide. So to recap again, why risk-limiting audits are better. The main point is to calculate the results accurately enough to make sure that the outcome of the election is right. Traditional audits, either a 2% audit might count more work than you need to confirm one of these easy contests, or less work than you need in order to actually get confidence in a tight race. So an RLA is going to use statistics to check those ballots and do enough checking, keep checking until it gets enough statistical evidence to be confident in the results. Very efficient. Next. There are three different general thrusts of how to do a risk-limiting audit. I'm going to show you the most interesting and coolest example called ballot comparison, ballot level comparison. And you actually have a record of how each individual ballot was cast, and you check those records in a random sample. A batch comparison is perhaps the most familiar. You would take the results for a precinct, and you would say, show me all the ballots for that precinct. And after the election, you would say, let's recount the ballots for the precinct, and let's see if they match, if the totals match. So that's another way of getting very concrete evidence. But sometimes even the data that you need for that is hard to get. So ballot polling is kind of like an exit poll. You again choose a random sample of ballots, but you don't have anything to compare them to except the overall results. So you just look at the results in the sample, and there's some sophisticated math that will tell you, do you have enough evidence? Are we confident in the result? So a lot of people think that elections are a lot easier than they are. They're actually, Americans demand more and more flexibility from elections, fast results, different ways to vote. And the result is that it's taking a long time to see, at least my vision of auditing all contests to get confidence. We don't have the data that we want in a format that's easy to audit, and we can't get that data very easily. And it's perhaps shocking to people that 20 years later, it's still so hard to get this data, and work is going on to get us there. But this is really one of the underlying challenges. Next slide. I just wanted to give a couple examples of what's going on. So in this case, we have a ballot and a tracking sheet for a number of different ballots. One of the things that you'll see in this picture of a ballot, you can't see here, but I'll show you a blow-up of it. On the right side of the ballot is a number and a date timestamp that is sprayed onto the ballot as it is being counted in this central count fast scanning system. And so if you go to the next slide, you'll see those timing marks on the outside of the ballot, and in faint ink, the actual timestamp and number of the ballot. This is what makes it easy to know that you're looking at the same paper ballot that corresponds to a particular cast vote record, the thing that we call the computer record of how each individual ballot was cast. And what we're going to end up doing then is sampling from the ballots and looking up the cast vote record using this information and confirming and actually asking humans to once again interpret this ballot and have a system see if the two interpretations are the same. And when we do that, we can, with extraordinary efficiency, confirm that the election outcome is correct. So move on. I'm going to skip a bunch of these slides, except to really make the point again that standards for data formats and transparency around releasing data in elections is critical to auditing. So we don't have the right data, it's hard to get it. Go ahead to the next slide. There's a whole bunch of work that's going on with different manufacturers and the voluntary voting guidelines and so on to try to make this happen. Again, move on to the next slide. Although you'll be able to see these slides online and click on some of the links if you want to get more detail. I also won't spend a lot of time on this, but I really want to emphasize if you show up and want to be involved in helping with integrity of elections and tabulations, you can go to your local clerks or election administrators or state and say, show me the data. I want to be there when they do an audit. I want you to do an audit. I want to make sure you have paper ballots. There's a list here and a link to the full details on a memo that show you how you can just ask the right questions and get the right information so that you can have confidence in your own elections. I also think that we ought to come up with techniques, and this is something we haven't done yet, but I want to come up with techniques that help encourage the public to participate. And I think one of the ways to do that is to give people data that they can verify themselves. They can say the computer record of this ballot was a vote for Washington and a vote for Henry and a vote for Susan, and then look at a paper ballot that evidently matches and say, I verified this vote. You can tweet out, let's say, I verified this vote, and help people show off in front of their friends that they're involved in the process, invite their friends into the process, and give yet another kind of data point that here's a real human that looked at a real piece of paper and it matched the reported results. So let's move on. I won't go into detail on this, but I will just say that we do find ballots that are misinterpreted by the election system, and there are reasons for that. People circle the thing that they want to vote for instead of putting an X through, or they put X's in this case on a candidate, and it's obvious to anyone who looks at the ballot what their intention is, but the systems don't know how to figure this out. So let's move on to the next ballot. I just wanted to say that we do find errors in tabulation. And I don't think we should shame election officials or manufacturers for occasionally misinterpreting what humans do. But I do think we should let humans express themselves, and we should look closely at what they've done, taking their time out to vote in an election. And having other citizens do that, other voters do that, is the best way to do it. Here I'm just going to touch on this notion of a risk-limiting audit and what is the risk limit. So a risk-limiting audit actually is able to guarantee, it doesn't guarantee that the outcome is correct. And a lot of people want to say that it does, but it doesn't. There are a lot of reasons the outcome might be incorrect. You could argue that misinformation on the campaign trail misled voters, and that isn't what they meant to vote for. You can also see evidence that registration rolls don't include all the voters they should, or they include voters that they shouldn't. You might have signature verification problems. You might have these ballot marking device issues where the machine actually printed out the wrong vote and the voter didn't look at it to verify that. So there are other reasons that can cause an outcome to be wrong. What a risk-limiting audit does is it guarantees to within the risk limit, to within some statistical threshold, that if you were to do a hand count of this set of paper ballots, that you would end up with the same outcome for the election that you do, that was announced in the election. And the risk limit is a number like 10% that says, if we were to have looked at this same result with these same ballots 100 times, 10 times out of 100, we might not have caught what the issue was. But 90 times out of 100, we would have caught the issue. And so the risk limit is the remaining 10% that, in the worst case, you might not have caught it. It's not a problem, in my view, to have even a relatively high risk limit if that allows you to get some evidence about an interesting contest. So move on to the next. One of the most fun things about risk-limiting audits in my mind is when you get a bunch of people together in a room and you have them roll dice to decide in a verifiably public way which ballots you're going to select. And so the way that we tend to do that is to have 20 people randomly picked out of a hat all walk up and roll a die each, and you end up with this big 20-digit number, which you then put into a publicly available algorithm that will allow anyone to verify that this number that I saw rolled by these people means these ballots should be chosen. And it's a public ceremony. It allows people to get together and talk about things. It allows soundbite for the news. It's a lot of fun. Moving along. And I won't show the video now, but here's a video if you go to the presentation online of a previous one. I'm going to skip this for the moment, except to say that one of the things that is actually a benefit of risk limiting audits, even if you really do very little else, even in the case of ballot marking devices, et cetera, is having a public manifest, a public list of where all the ballots are and how many there are. That's all a manifest is, but it allows us to do this random sampling. So we say in Boulder County, on the first device in batch 1 or 2 or 3, there are 146 ballots, or 142 ballots in the second batch, 147 ballots in the third batch. And you put them in order, and now if you choose the 247,000th ballot in the election to audit, you can use this list to determine exactly which ballot it was. Just putting this list together, which has to be done independently of the voting system, we have to have humans in other ways getting these counts of all the batches and identifying the batches, sometimes helps election officials notice that, oh my goodness, we never actually counted that batch, or we counted that batch twice or something. So the record keeping involved in even being able to produce a manifest is another form of audit and another way that we benefit the overall election integrity. And I think Amber, who was talking to us this morning, and Jennifer Morrell, one of her colleagues, have really emphasized how much doing risk limiting audits has helped them with the whole flow of paperwork and tracking of the election in ways that are good for the election in other ways. I'll skip that for the moment, except to know that what we really audit are not ballots, but the individual sheets of paper, the cards of a ballot, because we really can't keep different sheets of a given ballot together. And we don't want to, actually, for anonymity reasons. So here briefly is what we've done in Colorado. And I've been working on this for a long time. I'm going to break down the 2019 audit in Colorado, but the first one we did statewide was 2017. And it was thrilling to see decades of work finally showing up in the state I live in. So in 2019, there are a total of 64 counties in Colorado, and 62 of them did this very efficient ballot comparison audit. 2 counties hand count their ballots in Colorado. They have just a few hundred people, and so it's very feasible for them to do a hand count. But in the other counties, we did this more efficient method. One of the things that we're still a little disappointed in is that they are only targeting 1 contest per county and 1 statewide contest, which is audited in all the counties, in order to guarantee this risk limiting. They're going to choose 1 contest, that we're going to look at the data for that contest and figure out if it matches the reported results. They're going to, and those are the only ones that they're going to guarantee the risk limit for. I think it would cost almost nothing. I mean, they do at the same time gather data on all the contests on the ballot. So they will actually verify, they will enter data about 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 contests per ballot. And that allows us to know something and have some confidence in all of the contests on the ballot. That's what I mean when I say that we audit those opportunistically. They're not a risk limiting audit, but they're a much better audit than all the batch audits or all the ballot polling audits that you'll see in other states. So what I'm disappointed in is that they could track down errors in any of those other contests pretty easily, because interpretation discrepancies are rare, and thus get official confidence and clear confidence in all the rest, and some degree of confidence in all the rest. So let's move on to the next one. The successes that I see in our auditing system in Colorado are that it's very efficiently auditable. Most counties do no more than dozens, or in some cases a few hundred comparisons of ballots to ballot records, and are able to get 5% risk limit on the chosen contests. And if you actually analyze the data, if you can get access to the data and understand it, you get confidence in a lot more contests via that opportunistic approach. And that's why I'm happy that in Colorado we do have all contests subject to audit. We're just not checking the results and following up on discrepancies with all of them. Colorado funded open source software that I got to help develop for these ballot level risk limiting audits, and this really fun random selection process that is publicly verifiable. Given the data that Colorado publishes, officials, or that Colorado has access to, the officials can check all the risk limits and can have excellent confidence in the outcome of the election. But if we go to the next slide, I still see remaining work to do with Colorado's elections audits. I think we should target the most interesting contest. The closest contest is generally the most interesting to voters. If we need to use a larger risk limit because it would otherwise involve more counting than people think is feasible, that's fine with me. I would rather actually look at and track the most interesting contests. Those are the ones that people are worried about. They're not worried about these judge retention contests or the ones that were very lopsided. And that would allow us, with the opportunistic audits, to have great confidence in many more contests. They're currently not sharing, they're sharing more than they have been, but not in a format that's particularly easy to work with. So I'd like to see more transparency around the opportunistic audits. And one of the things that they're not sharing at all that I somehow managed to not put on the slide, they're not sharing the actual, well, here I say publish the cast vote records. They're not sharing the actual data that they're auditing. And that's a fundamental flaw. If an audit doesn't tell you what it is that they're going to audit before they start the audit, then in principle, they could audit something different and just tell you everything looked good. There are challenging anonymity issues that make some of that necessary. I think we need to really weigh in and resolve those issues and be able to publish the cast vote records so that the public can get full confidence in the results. Right now, the public knows that officials can have confidence, and so we're not worried about hacks from other countries, but you're always worried about internal things. Another thing that I want to emphasize that I do know was on the other version of the slides that I thought were online is right now the Secretary of State is mandated to choose the contests that are to be audited. And that's a problem especially anytime the Secretary of State is running for office. I mean, in the most recent election, the Secretary of State did, where they were elected, they did choose to audit their own contest, and that was good. But we shouldn't have that in a partisan office. There should be a better method, and we should audit pretty much all the contests in a better way. And there are some ballots that are actually not voter verifiable in Colorado. We sometimes claim that they are, but people either fax in their ballots from overseas, or they email their ballots in a small number of cases, or they use other systems in Colorado to do a better election, to allow them to vote remotely. And we treat those as if they're voter verified, but they're completely not voter verified. The voter does not see the record that ends up at the election office. They hope that the email got through, or they hope the fax got through, or they hope that the online systems weren't hacked, and there are better online systems in Colorado to do that. But we should treat those with much more suspicion than not suspicion. I don't want people not to feel good about voting, and my T-shirt makes it very clear that that I want people to vote. But I think we're not handling that quite openly. Next slide. Other states are doing, have even greater challenges when it comes to auditing. When we have the central count system that we do in Colorado, we can do this matching up of ballot to individual cast vote record. But if you cast your ballot on an in-person scanner, those cast vote records have to be randomized. We don't have yet effective ways to anonymize them and thus to be able to match them up. And so what we have to do is this much less efficient ballot polling audit or batch comparison audit. And in both cases, you end up touching a lot more ballots and checking them. So that means they're even less likely to audit that 1% or 2% contest that has a really tight margin that in a ballot polling audit could take tens of thousands of ballots to audit a very close contest. We haven't seen anyone step up to do that much auditing. And without better auditing methods, I'm just afraid, and better voting systems that make those methods possible, I'm afraid that we're not going to do the most interesting contests. Great, I think we're pretty close to the end. So there's some fabulous new software that's able to handle these new auditing methods. I get to work with Professor Purvi Vora at George Washington on some, it's amazing how interesting the math can be around improving some of these auditing methods. Next slide. We're doing audit laws and pilots spreading to countries, to many states around the country. So Rhode Island, New Mexico. I got that wrong. I mean to say Nevada requires RLAs. New Mexico has a better audit than most, but not risk limiting. California and Washington are passing laws around these things. And pilots now in a whole bunch of states. So next slide. We do now have methods to audit instant runoff voting, one of the forms of voting, of tabulating a ranked choice ballot. And they just did an audit in San Francisco that uses this very cool new method. We still can't do the best audits of a single transferable vote method, but we can do great audits of ballot, of proportional representation. So next slide. Just a quick run through the various methods. All of these are solved. These are the most common methods, including star voting, which is an excellent voting method. Next slide. The multi-winner methods, we have great approaches for most of these, except single transferable vote, which is actually an excellent method. And I'm not too worried that audits are not quite as good with those as we'd like. Next slide. So I just want to emphasize again the importance of getting voting systems that are auditable and in which even the close contests can be audited. The only ways that we have in hand to do that are central count or other places where we can match ballots to particular cast vote records, and that's the central count systems and the hand-marked systems. And I also really think it's important to audit all the contests. To some degree, even if you don't hit some really important close risk limit, I think we should look at the paper for those. Online, you can follow some of these links. The top one really has this information and much more distilled in it. But the next slide will show you where this presentation is. And if that ends up, if you have some of the links to the presenters, you can probably chase that down for me. I really want to thank Harvey Branscombe for his help polishing this. I'm sorry that somehow his edits didn't get in here, but if you look online, you'll see those. Harvey is unfortunately off in San Diego and can't be with us. But thank you again, Harvey, for enormous work over the years in Colorado coming up with better election integrity. And he has an excellent website, electionquality.com, that covers a lot of issues in more depth than even many of the experts get to.
Well, thank you, Harvey, for sure. So, well, Neal, thank you for all of that information. We've got probably a few minutes here to wrap it up. If we have maybe one audience question. Anybody has? Right, there we go.
Yeah, thanks, Neal, so much for all that detail. One question I wanted to ask is, have you ever seen sort of a successful case that you can point to where some sort of audit, maybe not as good as some of the techniques you're promoting, but something along these lines was successfully used where after the fact some irregularity was found and it was sort of decisive in turning around some bad result? Thank you.
I'll do two examples. So one, I think I had it in an early slide. I think it was Palm Beach County. I might have the name wrong, but there was a county that did a routine post-election audit, and they saw a wide discrepancy. I wasn't there. I don't know the details on how they did it, but they found that, and they said, wow, we got to do more of this. There are other cases where it wasn't a formal audit, but people just looked at the results and they said, that's crazy. This happened in Pennsylvania in a recent election in a county. The person who ended up winning or being declared the winner only had 164 votes in the first tally. And people are going, that's just not credible. The same thing happened in Rhode Island in, I believe, 2016. This was a small election. It was a bond measure or something like that. And people just looked at the results and they said, that's crazy. I think the problem is there are way more elections where they weren't so obvious and we weren't doing careful audits and we haven't noticed that. And so all the times that we hear, gosh, but does this ever really happen? Is this a problem? The answer is, we don't know. We aren't auditing. We aren't looking at the paper. So it's critical to look at the paper. We see individual discrepancies in every audit that I've been at in person, and outcome discrepancies in elections often enough that it's abundantly clear that we need to be checking more. Thanks.
I think we have another audience question. I want to go ahead and, do you have a question real quick? Yes. I want to do it.
Hi there. I was wondering if you have percentages on, let's just have two categories or three categories, elections that are not audited at all, elections that are lightly and perhaps you would say like not that great of audited, or ones that are audited quite well or at least better than most of the others, if you had to clump them into those groups.
I would say that there are very few places in the country that do rigorous audits. We actually have a set of guidelines, best practices for post-election audits, and we haven't done an actual check across the country in detail, but there are only a few states that I would say are actually auditing previously announced results to paper ballots in a way that would catch the most important things. At the same time, there are, I think, half the states or on that level that do some sort of auditing, so they're going to catch some of these issues. It's the number of different ways that people do elections and do audits. We aren't collecting data. Actually, one of the things that we have just sent off this week, there's a group called the State Audit Working List that anyone is welcome to ask me more about. Send in comments to the Election Assistance Administration, who sends out a survey to all jurisdictions after big elections, asking for them to ask jurisdictions for more data about their audits, because it's a difficult job even figuring out what the laws are, to say nothing of the actual practices on the ground. So when people look, they usually see things that need some improvement. But there's a lot of people, especially in the last year, literally the last year, stepping up to doing most of the pilot audits that I pointed out, and recognizing that this is really critical. We need to get on it. Great
Well,
question.
thank
I
you.
should have had more data on that.
And thank you so much. So this is Neal McBurnett of RiskLimiting Audits. It's great to have you here today. Thank you, Neal, for sharing your
Cheers. Thank
knowledge.
you.
Cheers.